Let me just start off by saying that to watch this particular video, you need to have nerves of steel. You probably need to have like a giant burly mustache, and you should most likely have a bunch of hair on both sets of cheeks. You see what I did there? Essentially, you have to be a grown-ass man to be able to take this type of content, because we're about to say some pretty graphic stuff. We're about to drop some absolute truth bombs that some people may not like, or it may brush some people the wrong way. So essentially, well, I should say, or I should clarify, there's not a lot of exposition here. It's pretty straightforward. The title says it all. The thumbnail says it all. I don't believe that Mattel deserves the DC license. And I know a lot of people are going to think that that's absolute nonsense, that that's buffoonery. And look, I'm never going to judge an OM for what it is that they manufacture at the moment. You have, for example, Jada Toys, who used to make tiny little die-cast vehicles and tiny little miniature action figures. And now they're potentially one of the best manufacturers at the 1/12 scale or the 6-inch scale. The Street Fighter line has been absolutely amazing. The Mega Man line has been absolutely breathtaking as well. So I can't sit here and base an OM on the past. Clearly, they have a ton of different lines. We've all collected Hot Wheels at one point, and maybe even Barbies. I'm totally kidding. I've never collected Barbies. I've never owned any, but I will say that LeBron James Barbie was really speaking to me. I am a huge NBA fan, and I have to admit that was pretty cool. But I've been paying attention to this line from afar. I've picked up some of their He-Man action figures or Masters of the Universe, and I have to say, and I'm not going to really touch on the 5.5-inch semi-articulated line, which, you know, I guess is kind of a callback to the retro action figures, which obviously I did not collect. They were before my time, but they're really cool. I mean, I do remember seeing some of these like at yard sales and things of that nature, or like at swap meets or toy stores when I was growing up, when I was a tiny little single-celled organism. But they just, like I said, it's not really up my alley. However, I have picked up some of the newer He-Man action figures, and I have, whether they're based on the animated or the old school series or the newer series or the comic book series for that matter, and they're very lackluster in terms of articulation. Like, that mid-torso articulation is so horrendous. The double jointed knees and double jointed elbows are okay. Whatever type of articulation they use for the legs, where the legs attach to the actual torso, are also just really badly designed. I'm not sure exactly who's putting these figures together. I think they're just really disappointed. They're really lackluster. The articulation just isn't there. You can't get these figures into crazy poses. And that really, to me, is a big red warning sign. Now, I will say the wrestling line, as far as I can tell, does have some pretty decent articulation. They do have, you know, the hinge. They do have butterfly joints, double jointed elbows and knees. But as a whole, the line really doesn't have that much experience when it comes down to like heavy articulation when it comes to their collectibles. And that really is a big red flag for me. That's a warning sign. I know there are a lot of people out there that prefer their figures to have better sculpt, better paint apps, but I'm more about the articulation. I think there's a balance somewhere in there. I feel like the figures can be really well articulated while having decent sculpt and decent paint work, and I just don't feel like Mattel is capable of doing that. And I know people complain about McFarlane and some of the QC issues that we've ran into with his line, but if you look at some of the figures here, and I always point back to like the first appearance Batman and so many of these other figures that have come along since then, like the Blue Beetle body mold, those body molds can get into some crazy articulation. Yes, the articulation points are wonky. Those ball joint ankles and the wrists sometimes stick out a little bit too much. The ugly giant pinholes, I think, was something that he should have fixed a long time ago. But just based on the articulation, and by the way, some of these come with a decent amount of accessories. Both that first appearance Batman as well as the Blue Beetle, I believe, came with just a plethora of different accessories at that either $20 price point or the $22.99 price point. I believe I picked up that Blue Beetle on sale, the single carded version, and I think I was able to pick it up for about $8. But the articulation on those figures is absolutely top notch. If you're actually interested in seeing like the engineer work at its peak performance from McFarlane, check out that Shriek action figure. I think it's one of the most massively underrated figures of all time. I personally picked it up for like $6 to $7. The articulation on that thing is absolutely insane. You can actually get it into like some super Spider-Man dynamic style poses. double jointed knees, double jointed elbows, butterfly joints, and then the soft plastic at the shoulder pads was a thing of genius. Like, this figure can get into some crazy poses, and that's what I think, that's what I'm going to remember the most from McFarlane. Some of these figures had great sculpt work, but then others were just really well designed when it came down to the articulation. And then later, you know, we were getting like cloth goods, wired capes, wired jackets, a crazy amount of different accessories. And yes, I completely get it. Nobody wants the 1/10/7-inch scale for the DC Multiverse. I'm right there with you guys. I would much rather this be a 6-inch line. But if that's really the trade-off, like if I'm going to say I just want the 1/12 scale for the DC Multiverse, it doesn't matter if the figure is subpar. It doesn't matter if the quality is not going to be there. We're not going to get any cloth goods, wired capes, any of that. I just want it to be a 1/12 scale. Then I just don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to respond to that, because if that's really your end all, just to have that scale from the manufacturer, then there's really no argument. For me personally, I'm not going to sacrifice all of that just to have a 1/12 scale affordable DC Multiverse line. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And you can look back at some of the older Mattel figures. There were no butterfly joints on some of those figures. It was just a single hinge at the mid-torso. Some of the head sculpts were absolutely horrendous. Now I get it, the line I think has been non-existent for about 5 years, so definitely the tech back then was much different. But even some of the counterparts, like the Marvel Legends action figures that were being released at the time, were so much better. It's insane to think that right around the time when McFarlane took over the DC Multiverse line, or the entire DC license, Hasbro was about to release some of their newest tech. Like right around the corner, they did the pinless technology for some of their bucks, and then eventually they did the newest Spider-Man body mold, which has the double ab articulation, which was kind of groundbreaking at the time. And as I said, this was maybe like a year or so, or maybe like a few months after they had just initially signed that new contract with McFarlane. And Mattel at the time, and even like towards the end of their line, there were some body molds that had some upgrades to them, but there were still a lot of body molds that had single jointed elbows, single jointed knees, an ugly little hinge at the mid-torso that sometimes lacked articulation. There was just really no competition between Hasbro and Mattel. And I know a lot of people don't like to compare different lines, but they were at the time two of the biggest manufacturers out there. And I know there are people out there that continue to say that Mattel has definitely stepped their game up, that they've evolved, that they've become a better overall manufacturer. Just basing myself on the little experience that I have with them. You know, as I said previously, I don't collect the wrestling line, but I have tried some of their Masters of the Universe line, some of their He-Man action figures, and I have to say, I don't see it. I still don't think that they're on par with the Marvel Legends line. Not to say that, you know, McFarlane was necessarily destroying the Marvel Legends line, but they were able to hold their own, even though they were still lacking in, you know, certain areas. As I said, the pinholes are still very visible. The articulation at the mid-torso sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired. The head sculpts aren't great. You know, the soft pelvic area, or what a lot of people like to refer as, you know, the diaper look for some of the figures. They definitely have their issues, but they have done some pretty creative features that still Hasbro to this day has not been able to evolve with. For example, the cloth goods for their Marvel Legends line, I think they've maybe done it a handful of times. They don't have any wired cloth accessories either, which is something that McFarlane has started to do. As I mentioned previously, the face plates and so on and so forth, I think McFarlane has definitely started to hone in on how to, you know, reuse certain body molds, but still make them unique enough to fit in with certain characters. And I just don't feel like Mattel was very good at that. I know I already touched on this in a previous video, but McFarlane also did a plethora of different vehicles for the line. He had like a handful of Batmobiles, Batcycles. He had a bunch of different motorcycles for different characters, whether it was for Batman himself or Red Hood. He had the Tumbler. He had the Space Hog for Lobo. He had given us some iconic villains, not just for our Superman display, but also for our Batman display, so on and so forth. There's just so many great examples of how McFarlane has moved the line forward, how he's done some pretty creative things with the line. It hasn't always been perfect, but I just don't see how Mattel can match that. I just don't see how they can match his innovativeness and push the line forward. I think they're just going to revert back to what they were initially doing, which was make some decent solid collectibles at the 112/6-inch scale, but with just no attention to detail, minimal articulation at that scale. And to be brutally honest, it always appears that they're going to be like a step or two behind Hasbro. I've often floated around the idea that maybe they're able to coexist with each other. We know Marvel Select and Marvel Legends does something very similar. Diamond Select does release like maybe under 15 to 16 different figures on a yearly basis. It's a completely different scale, different points of articulation. Maybe they could do something like that where they can both coexist, because McFarlane at this point just needs to put the finishing touches on some of their collectibles or some of their waves, and then Mattel could maybe hit the refresh and just start bombarding us with collectibles. But I don't think that's a real world possibility. I think McFarlane is going to start moving on to some of the bigger and better projects. We already have TMNT, we have a classic Mortal Kombat wave, we have the Marvel statues, which appear to be selling extremely well for him. It's sad, it's a new era, but I just don't feel like Mattel has done enough, at least in my personal humble opinion, to take over the DC line. I think this bare bones had to do more with money. They completely outbid McFarlane, and at some point McFarlane just didn't feel like it was worth it. He feels potentially like he needs to put more effort into maybe his own Spawn line, maybe some of the video game franchises that he's been working on, maybe even more into the comic book universe. Only time will tell. But as I said, I just haven't seen enough from Mattel to say that they've earned the DC license. But as always, this is just my personal humble opinion. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Let me know down below in the comment section. Are you ready for Mattel to take over the universe? Are you willing to sacrifice the great features that McFarlane has offered us just for the sake of the action figure line being 112? Is that really all you care about, or do you want that balance from Mattel? Let me know down below in the comment section. Very curious to see what you guys have to say. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, if you guys like this type of rambling content, we actually do it pretty consistently. We're doing it up to like a daily basis right now. It's definitely very fatiguing. It sometimes burns you out a little bit, but I will say, guys, every time I put these videos together and I see the final polished product or the final video, the final cut, I'm just happy. You know, I love putting together the content. I love seeing you guys interact, and hopefully you guys enjoy it just as much as I do. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Stay safe out there. Enjoy the hobby. Pose your action figures. Photograph them, especially if they're the DC Multiverse from McFarlane, because they're going away very soon. Stay safe out there. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.